Hello, I'm Alan Weil, Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. We're delighted to have you with us for the latest in our series of policy spotlight discussions. The U.S. healthcare system is a leader in many areas. Two of those areas are innovation, which we generally see as a good thing, and high prices, which we mostly view as a problem. These two attributes come together when we talk about biomedical innovation. Whether we're discussing the current congressional debate over drug pricing, or we're seeking lessons from our experience with COVID-19, the topics of innovation and prices are sure to come up. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. BIO is the world's largest biotechnology advocacy group, representing 1,000 life sciences companies and organizations from 30 countries. We'll cover topics ranging from drug pricing to the challenges facing the next FDA commissioner and more. Policy Spotlight is a series of virtual events Health Affairs launched this spring, featuring in-depth conversations with influential health policy experts. Previous Spotlight guests have included CMS Administrator Chiquita Brooks-LaSure and CMMI Director Liz Fowler. As we begin, I would note that you can submit questions using the Q&A box on your screen. I'll try to get to as many questions as time allows, but I can't promise anything. And we are recording this video and we'll post it on the events page at Health Affairs within a couple of days. It's now my great pleasure to start the program by introducing to you Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, as I said, President and CEO of BIO. Before joining BIO in 2020, Dr. McMurry-Heath was Global Head of Evidence Generation for medical device companies, and then Vice President of Global External Innovation and Global Leader for Regulatory Sciences at Johnson & Johnson. She's been an Associate Science Director of the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and was Senator Joe Lieberman's top legislative aide for Science and Health. Dr. McMurry-Heath is a medical doctor and a molecular immunologist by training. Her undergraduate degree is from Harvard University in biochemistry. She received her MD and PhD from Duke's Medical Scientist Training Program, becoming the first African American to graduate from the program. Among many accomplishments, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar. Dr. McMurry-Heath, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It really is a pleasure to be able to spend this hour with you. Before we get started on the content, of which there's much to cover, tell us a little bit about BIO. I think those of us who work in healthcare, we've all heard of pharma, and we kind of know there's this thing called BIO out there, but tell us a little bit more about your organization.
Of course. Well, BIO is the world's largest advocacy organization for biotechnology. So we represent over 1,000 members, many of whom are biotechnology companies, but they also include academic institutions, investors, and others that participate in the biotechnology ecosystem. We have everything from the very smallest biotech companies among our company members to the very largest. And we have members in over 30 countries around the world. We're really focused on how we both accelerate bio research and not just biomedical research, because we also cover agriculture and environmental biotech. But also, as we are speeding this research, also harnessing the research for equity, sustainability, and health. Those are really our cornerstones. So we do this through convenings, through advocacy, and through really being fearless about being the voice of science and standing up for the power of science to transform lives. That's something I believe at my core, and I think is playing out every day around us to a greater and greater degree.
I look forward to weaving those topics into our conversation. Uh, I can't help but start with sort of the elephant in the room. And when we have conversations like this, one of my goals is to make sure that the shelf life of this is a year or two, not a week or two. So I don't want to focus in on congressional proposals on drug pricing and price negotiation and the intricacies and what your organization is for or against, because that all might be superseded, in a matter of days or weeks or months. But I'd like to have a somewhat higher level conversation. Those who work in this policy area often hear that pretty much anything that would rein in prices is going to be an impediment to the next biotechnology innovation, which sort of draws a line that says you can't touch the system or it's all going to fall apart and no one's going to get the cures that our scientists are able to create. That to me is sort of a conversation stopper. And I guess I'd like to have a conversation starter with you. How do we think about the trade-offs between prices, which after all are highly relevant to accessibility of people actually benefiting from the innovation, and the ability for us to experience that kind of innovation? How do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah. So let's start with what we know is working, and not only working, but essential to not just Americans standing around the world, but to health of patients, not just here in the US, but around the world. And that is the last standing Western ecosystem that produces efficient, effective, and dynamic biomedical breakthroughs. The US ecosystem is incredibly powerful. We've seen this in the response to COVID, for example. There have been over 1,000 research and development projects started in response to COVID over the last year and a half. Over 50% of those were based in the US, and 70% of those took place in small companies. So the US conducts more of this cutting edge research than the rest of the world combined. And that's not by accident, that's through decades of advancement and evolution of our ecosystem. And that kind of progress and impact is very, very important for patients. So we have to make sure that we continue to keep that vibrant. But that's just part of it. You know, equity is a very important cornerstone of what bio stands for, not just since I came on board a year and a half ago, but also for a much longer degree. Bio's been standing, shouting from the rooftops that we need to make sure that patients are shielded from undue out-of-pocket costs, that, you know, being ill is enough skin in the game. You know, everything we have from co-pays to prior authorizations to deductibles, all of those are hurdles that are deliberately placed in the path of patients, preventing them from following their physician's recommendations. And that is not the type of healthcare system that I think any of us should want or should stand for. So we must make sure that patients are able to be unfettered in following their physician's advice. Now, let's talk about how we accomplish that in a way that we as a society can afford. We need to realize that in part, biomedical research is an expensive enterprise and a risky enterprise. You know, I mentioned those 1,000 research and development projects. Over 250 of them were vaccine candidates, for example. And we've ended up with a half a dozen vaccine candidates that have actually made it to market. That type of yield, that low success rate, is typical for biomedical research. And so we have to find a way as a society to pay for both the failures and the successes if we want to continue to see the rate of progress that we've come to depend upon. So that's critically important. And there are many ways to do this. There are many ways to figure out how we share the burden and at the same time continue to take advantage of the vast investment that the private capital markets have placed in biomedical research. The cheapest way for us as a society, as a government, to get solutions and cures out the doors to patients is to continue to have investors drawn into the space where they are shouldering the bulk of the risk and the bulk of the burden. And that has to be continued incentive. We need to do everything we can to continue to draw investors into the space. Any policy initiative that discourages that investment will either decimate the research and development landscape or leave the government funders with more of the burden of shouldering that research. And government track record, unfortunately, of funding biomedical research that actually turns into products is not that strong. Over the last 10 years, for example, studies from the Vital Transformation Group have shown that the larger the percentage of NIH funding in a phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trial, the lower the chances of success of that product on the marketplace. So the capital markets are just much more efficient at picking the likely winners that are likely to have huge health impacts than our government funders. So we need to protect what is working in that ecosystem while having a very frank conversation about how we can reduce the overall cost of development and at the same time bring solutions to patients. Now, you might say, well, how do you propose to do that? Other than capping artificially the prices, how can that be done? I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we not just pretend like the cost doesn't exist, but how can we actually reduce the cost of developing new breakthroughs? We have companies that turn to us and say, 90% of our development cost and 90% of the time of development, two things that patients care desperately about, time to a cure and the cost of a cure, are sunk in clinical development costs. We have gotten a completely unwieldy clinical trial paradigm that leads to incredibly lengthy and expensive clinical trials that don't actually very well predict what happens when a drug comes to market. So you've got me on my soapbox. I'm giving you probably a lengthier answer than you would have liked, but I think we need to start asking ourselves, what are the true drivers of cost of biomedical innovation, and how can we come together in a collaborative way to bring down those costs while still having assurances of safety and efficacy?
So you gave me a lengthy answer, but it's important that you have an opportunity to spell this all out. Um, what I'm having a little difficulty with as I listen is how to take sort of we need to have a conversation about the hard things, but we need to leave in place what we like, is a little bit what it comes across to me. And so
Well, that's true.
so the question is, how do we move past the hard conversation to actually some solutions? I guess I'm struck by the notion that the cheapest way to uh, to get this done is through private investment. I mean, I actually haven't heard anyone say that sentence before. It doesn't mean it hasn't been said. Um, that means, though, that it's the yield on investment that attracts the private investment, and it's the yield that is the motivation for prices to be high enough to generate that yield. So, again, the puzzle I suppose I'm left with is, if that's the engine, if it's the most efficient engine, that engine is built on a platform of pricing that leaves a lot of people out. And so I appreciate the goal of reducing cost. You began talking about the importance of equity. From an equity perspective, how do we address prices in a way that maybe sustains the interest in innovation that you see as valuable, but addresses the inequitable access to drugs that is part of the current structure?
Right. Well, I think you're making a common conflation, which is that the cost of developing new medicines actually has nothing to do with the price for patients. There are many things that we decide are a societal good: college education, mortgages for houses, home ownership, that we as a culture subsidize because we think it's important for the advancement of, of our culture and of our way of life. So there's the cost to get to the end goal that we want to achieve. And then there's the price that we pass on and make a burden for the end consumer. We must have low, affordable, and accessible costs for prices for pharmaceuticals. We must have prices that patients can afford and that do not deter patients from following their physician's advice. But that does not do anything to change the cost of developing that innovation for the patient. And unfortunately, we at this point, when we have a pretty low yield, usually 1 out of 10, of successful biomedical research and development projects, we have to, as a society, figure out how we're going to pay not just for the successful winners that we can never predict, other than through the rear view mirror, as well as paying for the failures. And so when you think about, for example, the percentage that large pharmaceutical companies spend in R&D, people pay a lot of attention to what they spend on internal R&D, but they completely ignore the huge number of investments that the rest of that budget, the rest of that P&L, is using to invest in small and emerging biotech companies, licensing agreements with emerging new technologies, that really are helping to finance this development of amazing cures. The way to reduce the cost of making cures is to ask some really difficult questions about what do we really need to be better at picking the targets so that we improve the success rate, that we get to a stage where it's not 1 out of 10 that succeeds, but maybe 1 out of 5 that succeeds, and that we reduce any unnecessary development costs through clinical and regulatory um, burdens that do not add to assurances for patients, because those are the two buckets of cost that are really driving what is today the cost of producing a successful pharmaceutical.
Okay, so I certainly understand that cost and price are not the same thing, but the gap between cost and price is someone's margin, and we allow for substantial margins on the pricing side. So if we totally disconnect price from cost, you mentioned societal goods that we subsidize because we think they're valuable. Presumably, these are medical goods that are of value. The question then becomes, who should pay how much for these? Maybe let me try to bring in something a little more specific. There's been a move toward what's often referred to as value-based pricing. So rather than pricing what the market will bear, which is really what we do now to the extent that there is a market, or pricing on the basis of cost plus, which might assure some form of return, you price on the basis of the value that the drug delivers. Is that a concept you all have discussed? Do you have a sense of what the pros and cons of that approach are?
So there's a lot of promising options in the value-based arena. Our member companies have been working very intently, for example, with state Medicaid programs to figure out how you spread payments over time, how you offer money back guarantees for curative treatments so that you can both have the financial incentives to create cures, because that's really what we want. We want medical interventions that work immediately, as opposed to medical interventions that you take once a day for 50 years and may or may not produce the desired outcome. So moving towards that sort of system makes complete sense. But we also have to ask ourselves very carefully, who is judging value? When I was at the Food and Drug Administration, we worked very hard on patient preference. The idea that what a reviewer might judge in terms of what's most important for a health outcome from a medical intervention might be vastly different from what a patient most wants out of a medical intervention. And there is no monolithic patient. What the patient desires and values can vary wildly with their demographic situation, with their stage of life, with their family situation, with the stage of illness. And so we have to make sure we're taking in the full breadth of how patients really are looking for solutions and how much a solution means to that patient. So, for example, many of the value assessment mechanisms that are discussed are often predicated on what they see in a pre-market clinical trial. We know sitting here today that our pre-market clinical trials are shamefully underrepresentative of the vast population. We exclude tons of pre-existing conditions and comorbidities that really actually represent the full panoply of patients afflicted with a certain illness. And we underrepresent women and minorities in our trials. So when you use the data from those trials to determine whether or not a medical solution is valuable to a patient, you are really looking at a very narrow slice of the American public. And as we all know, values in the US vary widely depending on where you sit and what you see.
Okay, we have a national effort, I believe, underway designed to try to improve representation of various populations, women and racial and ethnic groups that have been underrepresented historically in trials. Um, is and so I guess the question is, what's the role of your sector in assuring that the data coming out of these trials is more representative? It sounds a little like
So we
uh,
don't actually have an official national effort to improve diversity in clinical trials. We have a lot of individual well-meaning companies and political leaders who would like to see more diversity in clinical trials. We at Bio have actually taken it upon ourselves to try to galvanize this sentiment into something that actually produces more diverse trials. We last year launched our bioequality agenda, which focused on three prongs. One was improving representation in clinical trials. Two was making sure that we were fighting for equity and access to the fruits of those trials, and that we were highlighting career opportunities for women and minority scientists and entrepreneurs, and making sure that there was better diversity in the supply chains that our companies use and utilize. We have a pretty robust clinical trial diversity paradigm and policy proposal that we have been working on with stakeholders throughout the ecosystem for the last 8 months now, that is getting ready to be unveiled. And it's incredibly important that we follow through on that. And in fact, we're just getting ready to launch our clinical trial diversity information website that we hope will really drive more information to more diverse communities, similar to our COVID vaccine facts.org website, which was really part of our driving understanding of not just COVID vaccines, but also the clinical trials being used to generate those vaccines in diverse communities. And we work very closely with our vaccine manufacturing companies to make sure that their trials were really paying attention to diversity. And we saw amazing yields with trials that had upwards of 40% diverse participation. So it can be done. We're showing that it can be done with effort and intention. And we are trying to lead that effort and intention. That being said, diversifying the trials is part of what's needed, but we also need to make sure that we're encompassing more real world evidence that is actually paying attention to how medical interventions are actually operating in the wild, as Jeff Sherman from FDA always used to say. We know that while we hold randomized controlled clinical trials in high esteem, they never truly completely reflect what happens when physicians and clinicians start using medical interventions in the everyday real clinical practice. And so we have to balance our artificial data that we get from clinical trials, which is, of course, important, with what we learn as interventions are actually used in the complete medical context. And we need both sets of those information from diverse clinical trials and information from the real world to inform how we assess the value and the impact of new therapies.
we got on this topic of value and how to value and what the early evidence is. An example, and you didn't refer specifically to it, you talked about working with state Medicaid agencies. I think an example that often comes up is the hepatitis C drugs, which is what I gather you had in mind as you were talking about that, or at least as a good example. I wonder, though, if we can apply that same thinking to some of the very high cost cancer drugs, which have, from a value perspective in terms of life extension, shown limited effects relative to the price of the new drugs. I guess the question is, if we're going to pursue paying on the basis of value, are we prepared to carry that to places where the value might lead us to a lower price, as opposed to places where the value would lead us to say, wow, this was really transformative, and it leads us to a higher price?
Well, if we are able to develop, and it's a big if, a value assessment paradigm that actually judges value in the context of disabilities and disparities, and the full range of diverse populations and situations that we have. If we're able to develop that, and that is a work in progress, it's something we've been working on for a long time. It's something many have been working on, and many of the tools that are out to date have been criticized by, for example, the disability community for undervaluing um, what they're seeking as patients in the future. We need to listen to patients and listen to what they value if we presume to dictate the value of what they receive. Um, if we're able to develop that, that's incredibly important, and we of course must pursue it. But I think once we get to that paradigm, we'll have something that one will point out where something doesn't have the perceived value it should, or is predicted to have. But at the same time, we'll have opportunities where we'll be shown to have vastly undervalued the importance and the impact of a new medical therapy. So I think it will help stratify, and that stratification is incredibly important because not all new drugs are equally as impactful, nor should they be. And actually, some of our more iterative therapies have incredible usefulness in the marketplace because they actually lead to market competition, which is something everyone hopes we have in the marketplace as well. So there's a room for a range um, of incremental health impact and benefit of therapies. But we should be open to the fact that as we develop the better measurement tools, it's going to shine a light on some and dim a light on others. And that's completely understandable and to be expected.
Yeah, I am sure it will always be a work in progress, partly because no effort of any kind to sum the value that patients place on any medical intervention is going to be perfect or unassailable. It will be rough around the edges no matter what we do. But let's imagine, so I want to make sure we don't have this mythical notion that we're all going to stand up and agree that we found the value metric and we have to wait for that to move forward, because I don't think that's realistic. But I like your point that that then becomes a platform for future discussion. So let's take something at the other end of the value spectrum, let's imagine a true cure for Alzheimer's, and I mean that in the true sense of the word, where the value measured from a societal perspective would be phenomenal, but presumably we aren't going to price on the basis of that value, or the drug would be outrageously expensive. So if we learn these things about relative value associated with different treatments, what do we do with that information? It doesn't just translate into price. What is the next step in using that information?
Well, getting back to the earlier piece as well, which is this question of value needs to be devoid of the question of price, because all prices need to be within reach of patients that need them, because the overall value to society, for example, to use Alzheimer's as an example, to have seniors not succumbing to Alzheimer's at the rate that we witness today far outstrips even the personal value to the individual Alzheimer's patient, which of course would also be incredibly high. So we need to do everything we can to encourage patients to take advantage of medical interventions that can save not just their own personal suffering and pain, but also the broader financial and social impact of their disease. COVID vaccines are a perfect example. The value to society of everyone taking advantage of this is huge. And so we also need to take that value and that benefit into account. So, of course, yes, the price is to one side. But now the cost, what I think might happen is that we've noticed areas where we needed to drive investment, where we needed to, for example, perhaps increase the incentives and draw for capital markets so that we drive not just federal investment of dollars, which are always going to pale in comparison in any developed drug to what a private sector puts in, but we also need to make sure we have the incentives to pull more private investors into the space as well, because it's going to be incredibly important for us as a society 10 years from now to be sitting here discussing a one and done cure for Alzheimer's. That would be tremendously valuable and important. So we need to think about that going forward. And if you look around the world at some of the more artificial value and pricing regimens, you see instances of things being totally out of whack. You think about the UK and NICE, for example, where only 40% of new cancer therapies reach the UK market in the first year. I can't think of American patients being satisfied with having access to less than half of the innovation that's being produced as it's coming online. Having seen the passion of patients while I was at FDA and the demand to have solutions as soon as humanly possible, I cannot see us as a culture waiting for that. And it also produces skewing. We talked about diversity and inclusion in this value assessment piece. I remember having a conversation with an architect of NICE who was talking about how his daughter, and this was hit home for me because we have our daughter through IVF, and fertility treatments were incredibly important and time sensitive to us and our family. And he was talking about how the UK health system had told her, yes, you're eligible, but you must wait 2 years, which for anyone who's gone through that process knows is basically saying you won't ever have children. And so he was so relieved that he had been able to save enough to send her through private care to get that kind of therapy. That's not the kind of value assessment and artificial pronouncements that I think we want to seek to emulate. We really want something that responds to the needs of patients and makes things as accessible as possible. Does that mean everything is possible to be delivered? Perhaps not. But we also need to not have artificial means that are developed by a very narrow set of the population to decide what is important and what's not important to patients.
So I was about to turn to COVID, but the last thing you said, I feel like you just did what you accused me of doing. So I need to push back a little bit here.
Did I accuse you of something?
Well, you said I was confusing price and cost, and I feel like you're confusing priority setting through NICE and the level of allocation to healthcare. If the UK spent as much as we do on healthcare, there wouldn't be a waiting period for these services because there'd be a whole lot more money available to provide them. They've made a societal decision to spend, half as much as we do, and there are implications of that, but I don't think their implications are because of what NICE does. The implications are because of the level of resources that go into healthcare. Anyway, I don't want to.
You just touch on something so interesting because you say, we have decided to spend a certain amount on healthcare, and that's produced an amazing amount of access. And yet, what you started with was the premise that we should decide to spend a lot less on healthcare overall because we're spending too much. So we have to think about what our investment is buying and how we value that as a culture overall. So yes,
So
they should not be conflated.
Right.
The price we set for a pharmaceutical should not be equal to the amount we want to invest in it as a society. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the policy debates are actually a policy debate about how much we should be spending on healthcare rather than the relative value of an individual therapy. And that is something we need to have a very frank conversation about what we feel comfortable pursuing.
Yeah, I guess what I'm having a little difficulty with is, again, these are both micro and macro questions, right? As a country, we spend more than anyone else. We do that through a lot of individual decisions, corporate decisions, government decisions. We don't set a budget, unlike some other countries. But then the pricing is also set through some combination of regulatory processes and market processes, and we could spend all of our time just trying to disentangle that. It's the interplay between those two, I think, that can go in many different directions. And you caught me doing it one way, so I caught you doing it the other way, which is that those are actually two different things, but they're related. The more money sloshing around the system, the more you can afford anything if you have the money. But the more money sloshing around the system as it drives prices up, the harder it is for those who don't have resources to access the services. So you mentioned, access to the latest cancer drug, and then the question is, what about access to insulin, which is not an innovation, but people have difficulty affording that. Surely it's not an either or here. And that's, I guess, the issue here is the allocation. It's both the amount and it's how we allocate. And both of those have to be calibrated, or else we end up with these really, what I think everyone would agree are suboptimal situations where we overinvest in, as you said, if we had better value data and more robust measurement, we would guide our investment in certain directions, and then we could also price differently to assure better access to those to the fruits of that investment. And we need to do both of those, and neither one of them alone can carry the whole weight. Is that a fair?
I agree. And I also think we need to have a much more conscious and deliberate conversation about what we want to spend on healthcare as a society. We have all these proxy arguments about what we want to spend on healthcare instead of actually discussing the envelope of what we want to spend, and then living within our means, which is, of course, something we should do. So that's incredibly important. And look, at Bio, we've been very clear that what we want to do is, make sure that as biosimilars and generics come on the market, that they become more of a public commodity. And at that point, after innovations have been on the market a while, that they come down in price, and that our innovators and our companies shift their focus to generating the next new breakthrough, so that we have a constant um, virtuous cycle of innovation. That's incredibly important, and we have to make sure that stays in place. But I I think I've seen so often people underestimate um, both the cost and the value of breakthrough innovations. And if you've ever had, as I know almost everyone in the audience has, a family member who has been waiting on a new medical breakthrough, or who has an illness for which a satisfactory solution does not exist, you know that the value you place on having that new intervention is incredibly high. And so we also have to be as brutally honest with ourselves about that as well.
Well, we're two-thirds of our way through, and I haven't even gotten off the first topic. But that just is a sign of what a great conversation it is. I want to draw in, you did make reference to COVID-19. It's impossible these days to have a conversation without bringing it in, but I want to focus a little bit more there. From the outside, this does look like an example of an area where there was significant public sector investment, significant private sector investment from the vaccine development side, setting aside many of the other public health matters, which were highly problematic. From a vaccine development side, at the high level in the US, I think many would say this is a success story. So my question to you is, do you view it that way? Was the balance between public and private right from your perspective? Does it set a course for going forward? I'll stop there. I have more questions, but why don't I stop?
Or, well, infectious disease, in particular, pandemic preparedness or bioterrorism preparedness, is its own unique market dynamic, because you're trying to get, as in the case even with antimicrobial resistance, you're trying to produce products that you hope will never be used, right? That's the bottom line. And so that is a very difficult market to really on its own get to the destination you want to see, which, for example, in the case of AMR, is, a cadre of solutions that we know can kill any superbug that comes on the scene, but is rarely ever used, because we are saving it for those superbugs as they emerge. So we must have some co-investment. It's probably the biggest area of need of co-investment between public and private sectors to get to the end goal that everybody needs, that sense of security. What you saw in the space of COVID vaccines were some of the companies really partnering very closely with the public sector. Often they were kind of younger companies, younger iterations, to get their products out of the door. And some really relying not at all on federal funding, other than making purchase agreements for solutions as they came online, if those solutions actually succeeded, which was a very big if. As I mentioned, those 250 vaccine candidates, even the ones that were successful at this point, would have a very difficult time even doing their clinical trials to prove their effectiveness to make it to market. So there was really a very, very constrained funnel in terms of research and development to getting to an actual product. So yes, we need a balance between public and private. That being said, the situation we see today with the level of vaccination that we see in the US and in Europe, as opposed to the levels of vaccination we see around the globe, is untenable. This is a situation in which, unless we can vaccinate everyone around the world and do it in a very timely manner, then we will not see the end of this pandemic. We will see the emergence of more variants that might render our current capabilities inadequate. And we will continue to suffer under this scourge. So we need to be making sure that we're getting vaccines out, not just in the US, not just in Europe, but to every corner of the globe. Now, there are many who would point to intellectual property as the major barrier to that. But I think it was very ironic that as the administration, the US administration, was calling for intellectual property waivers as the real key towards global vaccine equity, at the very same time, there was the invocation of the Defense Production Act, which was basically barring exports of US manufactured vaccines to fill orders around the globe. So, what does that mean exactly? Our companies were mandated that if you're producing vaccines or manufacturing vaccines in the US, that you had to fill your US orders first. So, I remember having a conversation with Panama and with Costa Rica, who had ordered at cost appropriate levels for their economy um, COVID vaccines from Pfizer in this case, and were waiting for their orders. But because of the Defense Production Act, their orders just did not arrive, and they were left scrambling to try to find doses from the Chinese to try to get vaccines to their population, which was not their preferred approach at all, because we all knew at that point that the Chinese vaccines were not as effective. At the same time, many of our companies had set up global vaccine manufacturing sites. For example, Serum in India was a popular one, but there are ones in other corners of the globe as well. And yet, in the case of mRNA vaccines, they have over 200 components. And what we soon ran into was that there was a global shortage of some of the ingredients and key components to make the vaccines. And that once again, the Defense Production Act limited the export of those raw materials, in addition to limiting the export of the vaccines themselves. And so our companies were working with, in this case, two arms tied behind their back to try to deliver their doses globally. And it led to a greater and greater disparity, one that now they're working very, very hard to try to remedy. We were called upon by the WTO about 6 months ago to say, okay, what can you do to make sure there's more manufacturing sites around the globe? And our companies have now announced or have in effect over 300 manufacturing partnerships in every corner of the globe. I would say every continent, but we don't have any in Antarctica, for example. But they have really done everything they can to start standing up manufacturing sites elsewhere. But even in those situations where it's an established partnership, they're getting them off the ground, trying to get those sites up and running and producing doses of vaccine inside of 12 months is a struggle for the ones that weren't already underway. So any waiver of intellectual property at this point would not produce a single additional global vaccine dose inside of 2 years. And I don't know about you, but if we're waiting 2 years, an additional 2 years for a solution for COVID, we are just going to be caught in a never ending loop of variants that are sooner or later going to best our best efforts.
I can appreciate the limitations of intellectual property relief at this point, but I mean, it would be naive to think that we're going to avoid the uh, we're going to avoid vaccine nationalism. Politically, countries are taking care of their own populations first, and they are committed more or less to a global response. But the political imperatives are national. How do we build that reality into this from the beginning? I mean, you're talking about the limitations of what we can do now, but what could we have done at the outset to make it less likely that we would end up in this situation now where there are parts of the world that still have very limited availability?
I don't think we should at all be complacent or resigned to vaccine nationalism. I think vaccine nationalism is not only cruel and unexcusable, but it's also, quite frankly, stupid from a public health strategy point of view. It does not actually protect your domestic population to have new variants coming into your shores in wave after wave after wave. So I don't think that is something we should stand for to any extent. Now we thought we were addressing this through efforts like CEPI and COVAX, where Western countries pledged to donate or to supply doses to COVAX, not just the donation doses, but all doses, in a system that had tiered pricing, so that every country was paying according to their ability to pay, and poorest countries were paying nothing to get access to vaccines. And when push came to shove, the US and Europe just did not supply their pledged doses to COVAX. And that is a shame that we will be living with for probably a generation. And it's horrible. I was in Geneva this last week meeting with members from WTO and WHO and some of the country delegations, and we sat down with the India delegation. And the Indian ambassador turned to our team and he said, all of the countries that were producing vaccines at the beginning of the pandemic pledged to donate doses. And India was the only one that actually followed through. We exported 60 million, we kept 20 million, and then we had a devastating wave of COVID. They felt like they unilaterally disarmed. And that breach of trust is something that's going to be so hard to remedy going forward. So we needed to have transparency of the doses produced. We needed to have public pressure for countries to live up to their pledges. And we needed to do it in a measured way so that, yes, you realize that countries who were manufacturing were going to demand a certain percentage of the doses that were produced. But to demand 100% of the doses that were produced is not something that any of us should have stood for.
Well, I just want to be clear. I don't disagree with your either moral or practical assessment of vaccine nationalism. I was simply suggesting that it's a political reality, and I'd love to not stand for it. There are a lot of things I'd like to not stand for that unfortunately I see around me. So, but I appreciate your response. I promised at the outset that we talk about FDA, and I still have one other topic after that. So I'm going to be really quick because we are running low on time, but it looks like we are on the precipice of having a new FDA commissioner. You've been there. I'll make this a simple question. What advice do you have for the new
Well,
occupant of that seat?
Rob Califf has been in the seat before. He's a seasoned clinical trialist and a seasoned leader. And I think he brings a lot of strengths to the role, not the least of which is a real familiarity and commitment to evolving our clinical trial paradigm. I'll say once again, anything that results in 90% of the time and 90% of the cost of new medical interventions, and yet at the same time does not faithfully reproduce what we see when therapies actually are used in the clinic, must face scrutiny and must be evolved so that it actually meets our modern needs and our modern technology. And so that is my biggest hope for FDA. And then rebuilding both the personnel and the morale of FDA. I mean, this core organization has been battered for the last 2 years. And the impact that that is having on the morale and staff retention, and not to mention the fact that they're about to face into a wave of retirements for one of the most important agencies in our government. we all as a country need to come together and support Dr. Caleb as he tries to restore the pride and the robustness of FDA.
We published a piece in Health Affairs of a large number of former FDA commissioners arguing that it should be an independent agency. Do you have a thought about that?
It's a very interesting concept because it does get battered. One, it's several layers down and away from being able to, speak very frankly about what it needs to any administration. And it needs independence in its point of view. I mean, the turf battles that you sometimes see within the Department of Health and Human Services can be robust. And we don't need an FDA distracted by that at all. We need one that really feels empowered to act and think and work independently.
I always like at the end of these conversations to talk a little bit with my guest about your career. You're a scientist, you're a clinician. You've had some really amazing places that you've been able to bring those skills to. I'll start with the sort of the easy question, which is if you're, and I'm sure you do, speaking to younger people earlier in their career, what advice, reflections would you have that would help them navigate maybe towards the seat that you're in today?
Well, the first thing I always say when I'm speaking to young women in particular is freeze your eggs. Give, it sounds like incredibly pragmatic and practical, but it actually will give you the mental space and the freedom to really think about your career path and pace yourself. Um, because it's important that you can pursue the things that are of interest to you, the questions that keep you up at night or make you angry. Those are usually the areas that you really need to focus on because those are the areas that you'll bring passion and excitement and commitment, and to not be feel daunted by trying to balance it all. I think that's very important. I have always had the privilege of doing what I love and of following um, the most intriguing questions that I have. So, getting an opportunity to work at the lab bench and see that pleasure of discovery and see what it's like to treat patients in the clinic, as well as work on Capitol Hill and to see how the sausage gets made from a legislative point of view and how regulations are developed and employed are was incredibly informative and educational. I'll say through all of those um, opportunities, I felt myself moving further and further down the innovation pipeline. I've always been interested in what are the barriers of bringing new innovations to patients. I really feel that generating scientific progress and disseminating that progress to every corner of the globe and the world that needs it is a huge social justice issue. It's the biggest social justice issue we will face. And for scientists or clinicians, not to realize their obligation to also be activists for science, activists for getting the science to where it can do the most good, is short-sighted and something I am passionate about ending. So that's incredibly important. And I think innovation is often discussed as a nice to have, um, something that is only for the wealthy or only for certain countries. And actually, growing up in Oakland, California, the daughter of a public health nurse and a psychologist who worked in the public health field as well, has shown me that many of the illnesses and dilemmas that poor communities around Oakland faced had or could have biomedical or biotechnological breakthroughs that resolved them. And yet it's not treated that way. So, we talk about um, reducing what we pay for pharmaceuticals, which is where we started the conversation. And, I always think there will always be the next Viagra, but we getting solutions for diabetes, getting solutions for stroke, getting solutions for heart disease, for obesity, the illnesses that are really devastating poor minority communities, that is going to take all of us stepping up to the plate to incentivize the research in a similar way to how we incentivized COVID research. We do not have a concerted commitment to biomedical research for communities of need. And that's something that has to change.
Well, that really does take us full circle to where we began, because the incentive structure that we have right now, as you said at the outset, is the engine of a great deal of innovation. But the innovation is focused in certain places based on the design of that system. I can't help but think, in response to your advice to freeze your eggs, that that's another sign of a system failure. It may be good personal advice, but it's only good advice because the system is failing a large number of people whose talents we're losing because of how we've designed the system. So your
Agreed.
evolution from personal experience and commitment to these issues to bringing that call for change and action into your current position, that comes through really loud and clear. Um, Well, we're coming up to the end, and I think rather than ask you one more question, I will say thank you so much for sharing so much of
Mm,
your time, your thought, your perspectives, your considered judgment on how we move forward on very complex social issues. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. I will say to our audience, if you like this policy spotlight, visit us at healthaffairs.org and sign up for our future events, join our mailing list. Listen to my podcast, The Health Policy, where I interview leading researchers on health policy issues. On Tuesday, November 16th at 1 o'clock Eastern, we'll hold a lunch and learn focused on health system transformation, where Deputy Editor Rob Lott will host Meninder Cullen of the University of Texas at the Dell Medical School. And we add new events to our calendar every day. So please, again, take a look at healthaffairs.org. Event sponsorship opportunities are also available. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. McMurry-Heath, for being with us, and to all of you in the audience, we are adjourned.
thank you.